This meeting to order. It is Thursday, May 29th, 2025. It's 11:30 a.m. and we're here to discuss the new employee background check policy. And I will turn it over to our prosecutor.
Okay, I appreciate it. Give me just a half a second for me to rearrange the screens. So that way it will look appropriate on your end. Let's do this.
Well, it's prettier.
Okay. All right. I think we're up. So, first off, just so everyone in the room has a little bit of background and context, no pun intended, the BOCC reached out to our office as the county's legal counsel and asked us to essentially spearhead the project of diving into background check policies for public entities, identifying what best practices are, what a policy might look like in order to be tailored to the needs of Shoshone County, and to really engage in kind of a holistic approach to educating, updating, and then implementing. The topic of coverage for today is essentially broken into 6 parts. First, we're going to talk about the purpose for background check policies. Next, we'll discuss the different types of background checks that can actually be conducted. And for those that maybe aren't aware, yes, there are different types of background checks. So we'll talk about that. We'll go through really this interesting component, and that is how do you actually evaluate the results from background checks? You do a background check, what do you do with those results? And what's the significance of those results? Next, we'll discuss the review process. We'll talk about the need for classification of various county departments and employee positions within the structure of a background check policy. And then we will brainstorm what a plan of action and next steps are actually going to look like for Shoshone County. Starting first with just an overview of the purpose for a background check. Background checks are generally rooted in the job application and screening process. So in other words, your background checks should be done before an individual becomes employed by a public entity. If it's happening afterwards, although they can be done after somebody's already started employment, there certainly are some additional layers or concerns that could come into play. In an ideal world, you're heading those concerns off before an individual actually begins employment or actually receives a formal job offer. Second purpose is to identify what criminal history might be relevant within an application. We'll discuss this morning how not all criminal history is equal, and it's not equal in the sense of the actual history itself, and it also may not be equal in the sense of how it's applied to individual departments or positions around the county. Last, it is intended to essentially put people on notice of the requirements before they even start the application process. So a well-drafted and implemented background check policy at the public entity level shouldn't be a surprise to an applicant. They should know before they even decide to apply for a job, this is going to be the expectation, this is the process I'm going to have to go through. When we look at the reason from the county's perspective, why it benefits us to have a background check policy, first is to safeguard sensitive information. At the public entity level, public entities of all types are going to have various types of sensitive information. When we talk about public entities that have access to court records, public entities that have access to criminal information, public entities that have access to personal and property information. Those types of things are things that the public entity is required to safeguard. So we've got to engage in a proactive process of ensuring that information that we have had the liability for protecting bestowed upon us is actually safeguarded. Next, background check policies can help you to protect your own assets and your own personnel. They can mitigate risk to the public, and the primary risk to the public is going to be in that loss of information or disclosure of classified information. When we talk about, violating any one of those first 3 points, we're looking at liability that now attaches to the public entity that's responsible for whatever loss, breach, or damage was incurred. And then last but not least, this is kind of the internal or HR component of it. It also allows us to better identify which applicants are best suited for a particular position. There are a number of different policy goals that your policy can have underlying that background check policy. I've listed 5 of them up here, and I'll just touch on them briefly. One is screening applicants, which I just noted. The second is communicating the requirements before applicants become employees. The next is developing a uniform system for employment standards, and that uniform system should be uniform across departments. Does that mean that departments can't categorize positions differently? No, but it means that if there are 2 like positions within the county, we want those 2 like positions to be treated the same. Understanding specific employment and security considerations is a policy goal. And last but not least, once again, hiring the most qualified applicants. Ideally, these should all be goals of a public entity, regardless of whether or not you have background check policy. So, background check policy isn't what puts these policy goals into practice. The hope, though, is that a well-drafted and well-implemented background check policy should be able to improve these goals for a public entity. Seated in the room with me this morning is Isaac Mumford. He is a 1L law student who resides down in the Boise area. He's got his bachelor's degree. He's 1/3 of the way done with his doctorate degree, and he agreed to move his family and kids up to Shoshone County for the summer to assist our office with work. One of the tasks that he had was to conduct a brief analysis of various background check policies that are currently in existence around the state and do a compare-contrast analysis in order to educate our office so we can identify what we believe best practices currently is around the state. As part of that process, he pulled a couple of purpose statements from a few different policies from around the state, and I put them up here. This one in particular, you can tell because it lists the county itself, but you can see that the various purposes that are identified by different entities can change. In other words, the purpose that the background check policy serves for us doesn't necessarily need to be identical with the purpose that another public entity identified. Additionally, because no 2 public entities are created the same, we might have certain roles, positions, or types of employment that exist here, which may not exist elsewhere, and vice versa. And so that will lead to some differences in why something might be a primary purpose that's beneficial for us, but may not be beneficial for another public entity elsewhere in the state. Moving next to different types of background checks. So I will admit my own ignorance. When we started doing this research and I got to see all the different types of background checks out there, they all became evident and obvious. But if you asked me to put together this list before I started looking at other policies, I don't know that I would have named all of these, right? These aren't things that normally come to mind for most of us. And I think it's important just to understand that there are different types of background checks because there are different needs to identify certain types of information that may be applicable to certain employees and certain departments within a public entity structure. Because of that, these different types of background checks have their own pros and cons, have their benefits, and also have their associated costs. As you can tell, some of these are very labor intensive. Others might not be near as labor intensive. Because of that, it's important to recognize that there are these different types of background checks, so that way we can analyze for different employment positions within the county what type of background check we might need. We'll look at the criminal history check first, and the criminal history check is kind of your most common. This is the one that typically pulls up things like warrant history, it pulls up civil and criminal case filings, it will pull up driving records, and this is when most people think of a background check. The criminal history check is typically what's coming to most people's mind. When we talk about a criminal history check, for some of us, knowing things like, an individual's driving record may be pertinent. For other positions in the county, that may not be pertinent. So I point that out just to note that the criminal history check should give you all this information, but what a particular department does with that information might change from department to department. Last but not least, time period in that last box. We've noted that 5 to 10 years seems to be the typical time frame that a lot of public entities use for many positions, but there are absolutely exceptions to the rule. There are some positions that have higher sensitivity attached, and we see public entities routinely grab a criminal history for an individual's entire lifetime. For other positions, we may just want to know, what have you done recently? So we may be willing to forego an analysis of criminal history that occurred 25 years ago, because we're mostly concerned about what have you done to prove that you're trustworthy, that you're law-abiding, etc. recently. And when we talk about this concept of how can we set up and establish a background check policy for a public entity where we're accomplishing all of these policy goals for the public entity, but we're also being mindful of what is the job market and what kind of access do we actually have to be picky. What are we doing to give people that maybe made poor decisions at one point in their life a second chance? And can we assist in that? And can we facilitate that? And so these are important considerations, and that's why analyzing how far back you want your background check to go is actually one of the factors that we need to consider. When it comes to conducting the criminal history check, so this is the type of background check that is the most common, there are two ways that this can typically be done. The first way is you can try to keep it in-house. That is, you can consult with your local sheriff's office. You can identify what their capacity is to provide this service. When it's kept in-house, it's typically kind of a two-step process. That is, your sheriff's office can typically pull some of these records, but they're not going to be in a position to interpret those records. You typically would use your prosecuting attorney's office to conduct part two, which is to actually look at that criminal history check and say, here's what showed up on it and here's what it means. The second option is a third-party provider. If you go to iCrimp, I think iCrimp's default is probably going to be to tell you to go use a third-party provider because it reduces risk and liability for the public entity. But as we actually staffed background check policies with iCrimp as part of our research we were doing, one of the things they're also cognizant of is third-party background check providers aren't free. So they recognize that from a cost-benefit analysis, public entities may say, well, that's nice that we can go out and get a third party to provide this resource, but we don't have the money to pay for that resource. So we're going to try to use our own employees that we have in-house. We're going to make sure they have capacity. We're going to say, hey, do you have the extra time to take on this extra work? And we're going to try to provide that service internally so we can keep costs down. So those are your pros and cons on the cost-benefit analysis. The second type of check that we look at is a fingerprint check. The fingerprint check checks against national databases. It should turn up all of the criminal history, so it should turn up any instances where an individual may have either been charged with a crime or committed a crime. The cost associated with it goes up from just your typical, NCIC or other type of electronic search. But what your fingerprint check actually can grab for you is if you've got an individual who maybe otherwise isn't in the FBI's fingerprint database, so they haven't had a reason to have their fingerprints taken and recorded, there could be an unsolved crime out there that has their fingerprints attached to it that nobody knows about. And when that employee, who otherwise has a clean criminal history, applies for a highly sensitive position within your agency, and you send in those fingerprint checks, you could find out that they were the responsible person from a cold case murder from 1980, right? And so that's what your fingerprint check gets you, that your traditional, NCIC criminal history check doesn't get you. The next is a polygraph examination. Polygraph examinations are one of the most labor-intensive ones. They have to be conducted by somebody who's specifically certified in performing polygraph exams. Oftentimes we'll see, some of your most highest sensitive positions within a public entity subject certain applicants to this level of scrutiny. It's not common for most public entity employees, though. Sheriff's Office, you guys use these on occasion.
Yeah, any deputy position.
Yep. So some of the positions within the Sheriff's Office, their policy is currently to use a polygraph for them. Your admin positions, though, your staff clerical positions don't, correct?
Yeah.
Yep. So, that's a really good example of, within the Sheriff's Office themselves, them utilizing this when it's necessary. Other potential checks, there are certain public entities that have departments that they know are working with public funds and have access, even unsupervised at times, to public funds. Those are the type of positions where you may want to consider a credit check, which is allowable. We don't have airports, but we put this up here just to give an example. Most airport employees are going to have to go through a security threat assessment check, which is a separate type of background check. Some positions you may want to consider a drug testing component to your background check. This is different from a drug testing policy, which is an ongoing policy. This is drug testing for purposes of pre-employment certification. So when the applicant is going through the process of coming on board, you're saying we're going to run your criminal history and we're going to give you a urinalysis test in order to identify, if you're currently using. Employment reference history, that's something that is, very minimal in cost. It really just takes employee time. You can do it yourself. But we listed it there because there may be positions within the county that we say, well, maybe none of these background checks are applicable except for, the least cumbersome one, which is just checking somebody's references. Once we've actually ordered some sort of background check, I'll use our criminal history check as an example. We have to actually be able to evaluate those results. So getting the check in hand is one thing. Knowing how to read that background check, how to interpret the significance of that background check, and how to separate out what is relevant from what is not relevant is actually a process in and of itself. There is kind of this acronym that's thrown out, and that is, what is the record, what is the reason, and what is the relevance? And so utilizing those terms, I think we can dive in and say, all right, how do we actually make sense of the background check once the county has it in their possession? First, your background check is going to return all sorts of information. Typically, it's going to return information that goes beyond just criminal convictions. It should include information relevant to charges. So maybe somebody was charged with a crime, but for whatever reason, the case didn't proceed forward. Maybe somebody was charged with a crime and convicted, but through the course of leniency provisions within the criminal code, maybe they had the opportunity to have the record expunged or have a withheld judgment or something like that. So certainly the fact that we've got criminal offenses on somebody's record isn't the end of the analysis. As the county's legal counsel, our office certainly can step in and assist different departments with helping in that interpretation process, but we don't have to. I mean, certainly there are outside third-party entities that make their living off of performing these functions, and so there are more than one way to skin the cat. When we look at the relevancy of records, we see that even if we do have convictions, not all of them are going to be treated the same. Not all of them are going to be of the same significance. There are felony level convictions even, we put Fish and Game up here as an example. There are felony level convictions that maybe a department's willing to say, okay, well, maybe there's a felony on your record, but I don't have a concern that would impact your ability to do this job. On the same token, maybe somebody doesn't have any felonies. Maybe they don't have any misdemeanors. Maybe they just have 37 speeding tickets. And you could say, well, I really don't want to put you behind a vehicle that requires a CDL with all those infractions, right? So the severity of the offense isn't necessarily the end of the evaluation either. Sometimes when we have a highly critical position, it's going to be important for us to actually dive into the specific case itself. So just because we can see that somebody has a felony or misdemeanor or something like that on their record doesn't necessarily mean that we should stop digging. Sometimes we can look at that record and we can say, okay, this person has demonstrated a pattern of conduct. A pattern of conduct is usually something that generates a higher degree of concern. We can look at the age of an offender. Although there are, age discrimination laws that we have to be aware of in the employment context, generally speaking, under the federal structure and statutory scheme, age discrimination really is designed to target individuals that are over the age of 40, and it's discriminating people because of their advanced age. There have been a multitude of examples where courts have looked at background check policies and they have approved treating individuals differently when it comes to analyzing the age at the time they committed the offense. So that absolutely is appropriate. We can do that. We can look at someone's criminal history and say, okay, well, maybe you committed this offense, but you did it when you were 17. And since then, you've demonstrated a pattern of compliance with the laws, so we're going to be able to look past that in this circumstance. As I've already hit on a dozen times, and you guys can see up there on the screen, the particular position that somebody's applying for is going to strongly dictate what the relevance of that conviction is. The particular circumstances surrounding somebody's conviction, this can be a lot more difficult to track down. So if it's an Idaho conviction and it's something that maybe we're on the fence with, there's ways of going through and pulling the court records. You can look at the PC affidavit, and you can try to gain some insight into what the circumstances are surrounding that criminal offense. You could have somebody that was charged with a very serious crime, but ultimately the crime maybe was dismissed because perhaps the primary and necessary witness in the case died unexpectedly during the course of the case proceedings, and the case never proceeded forward. So I'm using that as just one example. You can also have an example where you can have greatly mitigating factors. We'll take, for instance, a DUI is something that usually is going to pop up as a red flag for any position within a public entity that's going to require somebody to be operating a motor vehicle, right? So it's going to be the type of offense that you say, okay, you're driving a vehicle, DUI is going to be a red flag that we're going to look at. Maybe somebody has a DUI, and as you dig through those reports, you find that they were up the Coeur d'Alene River Road with their spouse who slipped and fell and cracked their skull open, and they had no choice but to get behind the vehicle in order to try to get them to a hospital. Maybe once they got to the hospital, law enforcement's like, okay, but you're highly intoxicated, so we're going to address that next. But those might be mitigating factors where you can look at the actual facts of the case and you can determine that maybe two cases aren't actually the same. Because of all of the things we just walked through, while you certainly want to have a background check policy which has an objective standard as its baseline, You don't want to have a background check policy that is so rigid that you lose the ability to conduct a case-by-case review. Are there going to be some instances where perhaps you could look at a certain set of, criminal charges or convictions and say, these are always going to be disqualifiers. We're not going to look any further. If you have this on your record, it's going to disqualify you from these certain positions. You can do that. But we've found through the course of our research and analysis of other background check policies that the most user-friendly ones are ones that strike a delicate balance between objective standards without, obviating the ability to go through and look at each case individually too when necessary. We pulled up here on the screen just a couple of examples of some of the evaluation criteria that we found in other background check policies. This policy specifically calls out in that first line that prior convictions don't automatically disqualify an individual. And then they go on to specify that they're going to evaluate certain factors, and they list out what those factors are that they're going to evaluate as part of the subjective analysis of that criminal history's relevance. Here's language from another policy where it says decisions shall be made on several factors, including but not limited to nature and gravity of the offense, time that's passed since the conviction, and nature and qualifications required for the job. So this is not near as detailed. It's much more ambiguous, but you can see where it still hits some of those highlights. This one gets a little more specific. It talks about consideration being given to all types of offenses. It parses out the different types, and then even goes into the fact that they're going to consider even dismissed and or discharged convictions. So they're putting the applicant on notice of the fact that that's going to be a factor that's evaluated. Some policies we found do have automatic denial provisions. Typically, these are going to be your positions within the public entity that have a much higher risk or much higher sensitivity. In those instances, your policy should call out, these are the automatic disqualifiers for this type of category of position, and you should be putting the applicants on notice that there's zero tolerance for those types of offenses. Some examples that we pulled, some public entities have sex offenses for certain types of positions that have to interact or could potentially interact with minors of the public as automatic disqualifiers. We found at least one example of a public entity that indicated that they're going to do a credit check on you, and poor credit or bankruptcy history is automatically going to disqualify you from certain positions within the clerk's or treasurer's office. And this is kind of an interesting piece that, once again, if I'm admitting my own learning process here, I never thought about the concept of access to removable goods. But as we started diving into policies and as we watched some learning videos and things like that, we actually found this is a consideration that we probably should be analyzing. And that is this an employment position that's going to be unsupervised and have access to a good or object that they can easily remove without being detected by a supervisor? And if so, maybe we should be looking at that type of position and saying, all right, well, maybe certain types of crimes or offenses that might not be that serious in nature, we want to be paying attention to, because we're going to be trusting you with, county goods or equipment, and no one's going to be supervising you. Some of the common pitfalls that, and these came primarily from our discussions with ICRIMP that they see with background check policies for public entities, is public entities trying to roll out a background check policy and then not having the proper structures in place to be able to delve into the legal significance of the results that are being generated from policy. ICRIMP gave numerous examples of public entities that said, oh, hey, we think we need background check policies. We're going to adopt the policy. We're going to, pay our local law enforcement to run a report. They're going to give to the department head, and we're off on our way. And when the policy stops there, this is where ICRIM typically sees these types of claims, because we're really not diving deep enough, and we're not understanding the legal significance of what's being generated in those results. The flip side of that coin, and once again, something ICRIM pointed out, is that as we start to put these additional layers of protection into place in the policy, we also have to be mindful that the policy becomes more cumbersome and more expensive to administer, right? So if we're going to be asking law enforcement to do more work on their end with the background check, it's taking more time out of that department. If we're going to be involving legal counsel and evaluating all the results, you're taking more time from that department. I can give more examples. It's just that's an example to demonstrate how, as we add these additional layers of protection, we just have to be mindful that we are putting more burden on our internal resources, unless, of course, we want to take money out of the general fund and pay a third party to do it, which, once again, is an option. But if that's not the direction Shoshone County decides to go, we've got to be mindful of it. The next common issue is the implementation of personal bias within the evaluation process. We're going to discuss, actually coming up on the next slides, how that personal bias comes into play and what we can do to mitigate it or minimize it. The last piece is missing information. So if your background check policy just says, hey, for every employee that starts working for the county, we're going to do a criminal history check, through NCIC or whatever, and that's the same background check policy for every single employee, we're probably not using our resources wisely. We could have highly sensitive positions that we're probably not grabbing as much information as we should be, and we've also got positions that maybe are much more risk tolerant and we can afford to take or incur more risk, but we're paying, whether it's to a third party or whether it's using our internal resources, to do background checks on people that maybe we didn't need. Moving to the review process itself, there are typically 3 ways that we can review background check results. The first is the unilateral review. Unilateral review consists of whoever the department head is or the person responsible for hiring, obtaining the background check, getting it in hand, and then undertaking their own process of looking at it, analyzing it, evaluating it, etc. The second option is a review panel. Review panels can either be internal or external. External, you're obviously paying for that review panel. Internal, you're obviously using your own resources, so you just have to be mindful that even though the cost is going to be less, you are, incurring employees' time. The last option is a third-party review where you outsource the process entirely. Looking at some of the pros and cons, the unilateral review, you can see, has the highest danger for misinterpreting the information, because odds are that, elected official or department head has a particular area of specialty. Odds are that area of specialty probably is not going to be in interpreting criminal histories. You also have, due to the concentration of authority in one position, a higher danger for preferential treatment or individual bias. In other words, if you've got, a department head that's reviewing the criminal history and, they had their lunch money stolen as a kid and they've got an applicant that they can see is stealing lunch money, maybe that's going to trigger something inside of them that might not be warranted or justified. And I'm trying to use a comical example because obviously, I want to shed light on the fact that sometimes those biases we don't recognize, but they can be there. The benefit to the unilateral review is it's the least amount of cost, right? You have one person involved, and that one person is somebody that's involved anyways, because if they're doing hiring, they're already, diving in head first into the application. And so it certainly is the least cost, but as I noted, it's got the highest risk. I'll jump over to your third-party review because it's on the other end of the spectrum, and then we'll finish with the panel. So third-party review, it's going to have the lowest risk and highest cost. There's going to be no internal bias, or there shouldn't be any internal bias. Typically, when you do a third-party consultation for your reviews, you're providing the metrics that third party is using to evaluate. So you're not letting them use their subjective opinion on what's relevant. You're actually creating a structure. You're telling this third party, hey, these are our different categories or the different types of background checks we want conducted. These are the different positions that it applies to. For these positions, any offense of this nature is an automatic disqualifier. Any offense of this nature is maybe a yellow flag where we're going to review the specific details. Any offenses of this nature we're going to ignore. So you're setting the parameters for them, and they're just responsible for rolling it out in an unbiased fashion and taking the work off of your shoulders for doing that. Once we jump into that middle category, that review panel, we're trying to blend the two. So we're trying to help mitigate some of the risk that comes from concentrating authority in one position. But we're also typically trying to keep the review in-house. So, maybe that review is put together by a panel that, the county says, okay, we're going to have these 5 people and they're going to be a review panel. We're going to make sure one of those 5 is, someone in law enforcement so they can assist with the background check stuff. One of those 5 is going to be somebody that's, in the prosecutor's office so we can have a legal opinion in there. And then the other 3 are just going to be, 3 unbiased, bodies around the county that can sit in and give a subjective opinion when we're starting to analyze, okay, maybe this type of a crime fits into this yellow category. Do we want to take that risk on as a county or do we not? And then they ultimately provide the results to whoever is responsible for the hiring. So let's say, applicant X is applying for a position within the treasurer's office. Treasurer's office is going to do the initial screening. They're going to narrow down the list of candidates. Then they're going to say, okay, this is my pick. This is who I'd like to give the position to. We need to go through the background check policy. They're going to send that in. In a larger jurisdiction, they'd send it into your dedicated HR department. Obviously, as the clerk and I have joked, HR department usually consists of her and I working in tandem because we don't have a formal HR division within the county. But in any event, that typically would get passed on to whoever's responsible for the hiring itself, who then would order the background check, convene the review panel, and then would give an affirmative recommendation to say this person passed or didn't pass. And then whoever's responsible for the hiring really takes that opinion, and that's the one they get to adopt. So they don't get to look at it and say, oh, well, the hiring panel said didn't pass, but I'm willing to look past it. I don't really care about DUIs. Well, we're setting the metrics, and we're letting that review panel be the unbiased opinion that interprets those results and gives us a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Looking at how we want to categorize certain positions, I think it's important for us to understand that sensitivity to certain information is a primary goal. What that information is and how we categorize its sensitivity can be different from one area of the county to another area. In the upper left might be information that deals with official documents or records. It might be individuals that have access to county financials or deal with actual money. And so we might want to do one type of background check for those types of employees. On the upper right hand might be employees that have access to sensitive data or electronic information. Maybe you've got, uncontrolled access to every voter's social security number in the county. That's pretty highly confidential. That's information we want to protect. And so that's an employee that maybe we want to hold to a higher standard and say they have more sensitivity in their position. The bottom is that removable goods component, right? So do they have access to, pull equipment off of a job site without anyone knowing or things like that? And so maybe that's a sensitive position that we want to be mindful of and have a certain type of background check conductor for that. It's important to note, and I'm going to point this out just because I think it's relevant to consideration, that we also want to be mindful of setting certain requirements that are also appropriate for what an employee is going to receive. And that mostly hinges on compensation to a degree, right? If we're going to say we're going to hold employees in this category to this extremely high standard, but then we're going to categorize them at minimum wage, you're probably not going to have, any suitable applicants, right? So you've also got to weigh that. You've got to say, what is this position paying, and is the standard that I'm holding them to a high enough standard? I can speak firsthand, and I can tell you that as an attorney, in order to even get my bar license, I have to go through an extensive background check policy that has nothing to do with my county employment. It has everything just to do with my law license. And they dive into everything all the way down to driving infractions. And then they conduct a review and say, if you have any offenses of the nature of X, Y, or Z, we're either going to limit your bar license, we're going to put you on a probationary bar license, or we're going to put in these safeguards to ensure that if you're practicing law, you're doing it the right way. The state bar can set that standard really high for attorneys because attorneys are expected to make a lot of money, right? So it's not going to dissuade somebody from becoming an attorney because they say, I don't want to be an attorney because I'm going to have to do the background check and have to keep a clean record and not commit any crimes, right? And so I'm pointing this out to say, as the county dives into this process, we do have to be mindful, and we've got to be cognizant of the fact that we can't set the bar too high for certain positions such that we don't get any applicants, but we want to set the bar high enough that we're also protecting ourselves from reasonable risk and liability. Looking at how we categorize the various risks, we can ask ourselves, how risk tolerant is the county as a whole? How risk tolerant are individual departments? In other words, maybe you have two employees, I'll use our removable goods. You have two employees that both have access to removable goods. The one employee's removable goods are pens and paper clips. The other employee's removable goods are welding machines, right? So what is the risk that individual department can tolerate for the type of position that they have? And then last but not least, how sensitive is the information that employee has access to? Is it going to be the type of sensitivity that if there was a breach and that employee was responsible for letting that information out, it would result in a high degree of liability if the county were sued for that loss of information? Or is the information let out, although you don't ever want to let out information you're not supposed to, if the employee did let the information out, the liability that would attach to that information would be much less. One other consideration that I think is important for us to be mindful of is ensuring that employees that are public facing are also considered. So even if they don't meet any of the other thresholds, they don't have access to important legal documents, they don't have access to criminal records, they don't have access to public financials, but maybe we have to trust them to interact with the public on a daily basis or to make statements or comments on behalf of the public entity in an official venue. I think we also want to be mindful of that as a factor which we should be analyzing for purposes of background checks. How flexible we are as a county with these certain departments are going to depend on all of the things we just discussed. It's going to depend on the risk sensitivity. It's going to depend on the specific criteria for the position, what the requirements are for that position, and that process, as this last bullet point points out in the fourth box, is a collaborative process. And that's a big reason why you all sitting in the room are sitting in the room right now. Because in order for the county to roll out a policy that's going to work, your input and suggestions is going to be vital. With that said, I'm starting to wrap things up. Here's a general plan of action and next steps as I view them. This can be subject to change, and certainly if the county wants to deviate and define their own process for rolling this out, you can. Step one is just to identify that your public entity doesn't have a background check policy formally in place, i.e. each individual department is just free to do what they want. Identify a need to try to unify that and create a system that can put both the public and the individual departments on notice of what the expectations are. And so far the county's done that. So we've checked box number one. Box number two typically involves tasking either an outside third-party consultant with drafting the policy, or if you're going to try to keep it in-house, tasking your legal counsel with the responsibility for doing the research, trying to educate your county officials on what the nuances and structure are of a background check policy, and then actually proposing plans for rolling one out. Step 3 is where we're at currently. So step 3 is where we are trying to identify what the components are going to be for a background check policy and how we're going to be able to tailor that policy specifically to our county's needs. With that said, I don't know that we're going to accomplish step 3 in the room today, but I think this is where we're at in the process. So once we get step 3 accomplished, then I think we can move on to actually drafting, proposed draft policies, getting things circulated for department heads to look at and give feedback on and things like that. In order for us to move forward, I think there's about 6 questions that really have to be answered. The first 2 questions go hand in hand, and that is, do we want to keep this process and the subsequent implementation of a policy in-house, or do we want to go outside and bring on a third-party consultant? ICRIM gave us some recommendations of some that they know public entities around the state use in order to do this. Question number 2 is, once we decide who's going to be responsible, if we are going to keep it in-house, do we want that in-house process for evaluating the background check results to be done by a hiring panel, or do we want to try to keep costs at an absolute minimum and just leave it up to the department head to review and evaluate themselves? Next, I think it's going to be important for us, in order to develop some degree of uniformity within the county, to figure out how many different categories of checks we want. So in other words, if we were to try to take all of the county employees that we think need some sort of a background check, and then say what types of background checks would be needed, how many different categories are we going to come up with? Is there going to be 3 categories? Is there going to be 5 categories? Is there going to be 7 categories? I think we've got to collaborate on that and figure out what we want that to look like. Next, we're going to need to determine what the different requirements are for each department. In other words, we've determined that category C applies to the employees in these 3 roles within the sheriff's office. Once we get those results back, what are we going to do with them? Are there going to be automatic disqualifying offenses attached? Are there going to be certain types of offenses that you're going to give greater or less weight to, etc.? Next, we're going to need to determine what positions in the county are actually going to be subject to the background check, and this overlaps with other administrative functions like your job descriptions in your employment advertisements. Both of those should contain this information. So once we've actually got a policy in place, our job description for a chief deputy assessor should say this position is subject to category C of the county's background check policy. So that should be something that's put out there, so that way both the entity and the applicants are on notice. And when we're advertising positions, that should be posted in the advertisement before somebody even applies. Last but not least, the budget considerations are going to be an important part of this. As your legal counsel, I'm always doing my best to straddle the line between saying these are the necessities of the public entity, these are the best practices of the public entity, and then these are our budget restrictions. Obviously, in an ideal world, we would always be pursuing best practices, and we should be. We should always be trying to mitigate risk, but sometimes budget considerations might require us to compromise to a degree on some of those things, and I think that's just a reality of public entity governance. So, with all of that said, I know that was a lot of information. I hope it was educational and beneficial, and I would be happy to stand for any questions anyone has.
I think what we need to do from this point forward is have each elected official and department head kind of figure out what backgrounds they need. I think for Lori and the treasurer, I think Tony would be a good resource on what he would recommend for what kind of background, whether you need a credit check or whatever else. But I think, everybody should go out, and then we can come back and meet and figure out who needs what, and then I guess we can zero it down from there.
Okay. Other questions, comments? Anything else from the BOCC for me?
No, that was like overload of information. We didn't process it, dude. We didn't put this plan together. We didn't have all week to think about this.
I think everybody just needs to
That's fair.
identify their concerns for the individual department first,
Yeah.
and figure out what the things that have been brought up that are your concerns. Do you have access to things that you can steal? Do you have access to sensitive information, criminal information, and all this kind of stuff that you can? So you need to figure out where your liabilities are, and probably it literally goes from position to position in some things.
Yeah.
It just depends on what they do.
And then also something that Ben didn't really bring up that might be further down, I might be getting ahead of myself. I'm one of the few departments that employs temporary seasonal
Mhm.
employees. So what would that look like for the temporary employees? Meaning some of them come back year after year, so we term them at the end of the season, then we bring them back on. I can't imagine that a returning employee would require an additional background check, but that's something to think about as well. Our parks employees, kind of the same thing. That was one of the first things that kind of came to mind as far as like some different things that are a little outside of the box.
Maybe like with your plow drivers, a driving record check just real fast between when they come in.
Sure.
Yeah, so I can comment briefly on that too. In a lot of the policies, there's a 1 year expiration on a lot of the temporary employees for a background check. So if there's been a year or more between their last employment, you would just do the check again. That's in
Okay.
GEM, and I think it's also in Fremont and Jefferson, I believe.
Okay.
I'd have to go for the document.
To build on it, you can also have a tiered background check where somebody has to undergo an initial background check, and then if position dictates, you can have them do a follow-up background check of lesser scrutiny in the future, right? So you might have some employment positions where pre-employment they have to do, a very intensive background check, and then every 5 years thereafter you're going to run another check just to make sure nothing popped up in another jurisdiction that you weren't aware of. So that's an added layer that you can consider. And, even some of those temporary positions, some of them might have a very high risk tolerance, meaning you don't have a lot of concern that they're going to be able to do a whole lot that's going to harm the county. And so because of that risk tolerance, you might be able to be really lenient. My seasonal employees, so my interns that come on board in the summer, they actually still have to go through a full CJIS certification because they have access to criminal records. And so I have to do a background check. I mean, Lance gets them. We send them over every, springtime when we're going through the hiring process. They do the background checks even for our interns.
Sure.
And then before they even step foot in the door, they're having to submit to us their certification results for CJIS and things like that. So I think it changes, right, from position to position. And it's just important to analyze what you think those needs are for your department.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you want to know, got questions about the most strict version of it, you can get a hold of probably me because we literally do background, full backgrounds with detectives. They have a background packet that's like that thick before we even look at their application that you guys can look at and see what kind of questions are on that.
How much do you charge, Lance, for
We
background checks?
don't charge much. It's like we just charge to do the fingerprints. That's pretty much it. And other than that, we don't charge anything. So
Well, and maybe there's a little confusion here. So you guys do an internal background check for your own employees, and that one's really invasive. You guys aren't providing that service for free to the public.
negative.
So that's important to note, right?
Yeah,
So-
we're only doing the fingerprints.
so for the public, you'll do fingerprints.
Yep.
But internally, you do a very thorough background check for
Yep.
certain types of employees.
Yep. Yeah, and then we just kind of scale it down depending on what the position is.
But budgetarily, I do risk management for several clients, and using third-party providers for low-level just check for wants and warrants and things, that's like a $10 to $12 to $15 expense
To run the report.
to run a report.
Yeah.
And so more and more of my clients are just making it mandatory for all new employees, because the guy who's working seasonally at the park who molested a kid
Yeah.
3 years ago,
Exactly where I went with
and,
it too.
and
It's
now
like-
we don't check, and for $12 they're just running those as standards. So I'm gonna, my bias in this would be that we lean towards some minimum background check for all employees. That's that 10 or 12, whether it's that $10 or $12 thing or whatever, and then move our way on up to what the sheriff's department's doing, but.
Yeah, I would agree with that too, because
Yeah.
with the other side of the service, the third party, you can get multiple. You can do credit check all into one and all that other stuff. And we want to make sure that it's not gonna. You guys should be figuring out how much it costs you to sit down and do our background checks, so that we're not.
Yeah, well, as of right now, we're only doing
Yeah, a few.
a fingerprint or something. We're
Yeah.
not doing anything, but yeah, we have a retired detective right now doing all of our backgrounds. So he's in the reserve budget, and he handles all of our hiring backgrounds, and we just kind of tell him to what level we want it to go. But he pretty much talks to everybody we hire. Just depends on who they are.
So what kind of a turn time is generally expected on that, like for in-house? I'm just thinking if it's a time of year where there are a lot of hires that would require that extensive of a background check.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to do that for a lot of people. It takes several weeks.
Okay,
'Cause,
that's good to know.
yeah, we do
But if you're just running a crim history,
just criminal history.
that can be something that, I mean, assuming you guys have staffing, I mean, actually running the check is maybe 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just a matter of carving out 10 minutes in the day to run the
Mhm.
crim history, which is that basic service that Dave's alluding to. I think definitely the more intensive part is not running the report, it's interpreting the report, right? So you get the criminal history back, what does it mean? What are the different charge designations? How do I make sense of it?
Yep. Yeah, that's always pretty much our first step. We get the application in. First thing we do is go run their criminal history real quick. Because if they got a warrant, I'm not going to hire them. And that's the quickest, easiest thing. Just a quick check, look it over. Okay, nothing that's really flagging immediately in there.
Okay. Any other comments or anything from you? Any questions? More questions?
At this time.
So do you want to give this a week, 2 weeks? Well, it's have to be 2 weeks. Then come back and meet again and figure out what you guys need for your employees and what kind of background checks. I guess you can ask other counties
This is
as
going
well.
Forward, am I correct?
Yeah.
We're not
Yeah.
going backwards.
I don't think so, right?
I mean, it's up to you guys.
That would be,
Yeah.
would be 150 people, or is that approximately 150 people? Or
I think they've done them before. They did background checks. So,
I guess to your question, Lori, if you sit down and you analyze your own department and you say, this position within my department has access to highly sensitive information, and you never did run a background check, you still might want to know that information because it still might be pertinent in, delegating that person's roles or responsibilities differently. The other thing is and my department doesn't use the general employment application form that the county has, but I know there is a general employment application form. And on that, I believe the applicants are required to disclose their criminal history. So if they filled out that form and they said, no, they didn't have any criminal history, but you never ran a background check, and now you do, and it turns up that past criminal history, I think you've got a whole different issue on your hands, right? And so I don't know that if you're asking for legal advice, I don't know that I would just close the door and say no. But I think you could analyze and say, okay, is there a position within my office that's highly sensitive that never did get a background check run? And maybe the person on their employment application said they didn't have any criminal history, but maybe we should just double check that.
Now, when they do a criminal background check, does the employee have to sign to say that you can do it? I mean, is that part of the application that you?
It's
So-
on our background application. It's a waiver.
It's a waiver.
In an ideal world, this policy is going to have some sort of acknowledgement or a waiver that accompanies it, but you're also going to be putting them on notice because all of your job advertisements moving
Yep.
forward should have a line in there that
Okay.
says employee subject to background check policy, etc. So
Okay. Okay. All right. Any other questions?
No.
Any
So
questions?
question on, so like the DOT, FMCSA, and they're safety sensitive for the drivers, CDL versus non-CDLs.
mhm.
Those are governed by CFR 49, and there's different sections, and is sending that to you enough to say this is what, so there's specific pre-employment things that you have to be a safety sensitive or a CDL driver,
Sure.
and then there's, other requirements going forward, but is that enough to give you what you need to kind of evaluate where that fits in any kind of a policy?
So what I would typically do is rather than try to duplicate the requirements of another governmental requirement, I would typically just reference it internally. So for positions that maybe are in your department where you're saying I've got employee X, Y, or Z that has to go through these additional certifications or meet these additional minimum threshold requirements when it comes to their criminal history. In our policy, we would be saying these employees have to meet the requirements contained within 49 CFR 2603, in addition to our own requirements, which might also include X, Y, and Z.
So in that case, we would be better when we send out an application request to say, in addition to this, you will be subject to these,
Yeah.
because they're a specific department and not try to do any incorporation in the general.
Oh, with
That'd be my
CDL, it's
recommendation.
basic. You have to hit the federal standard. You can go above and beyond the federal standard, but you have to meet the minimum federal standard, which is your driving record, drug, alcohol.
Perfect.
Okay.
That's-
There's nothing further. We'll schedule it in 2 weeks.
And
All right.
do we want to reconvene with all that feedback, or do you just want to have a deadline for everyone to send their feedback?
That'd probably.
I'm
be
assuming
good.
it's going to be to me. I mean, it
Yeah.
sounds like that's the direction
Okay.
I'm getting.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we
Okay.
can do that.
I mean, it's up to
Deadline,
you guys. I
yeah.
don't know if everyone.
Yeah, it might be easier that way anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can go through it.
Yeah,
Okay.
And we appreciate you
Yeah.
making the time, because that's a
Yes.
big job.
yeah.
Yeah, you bet.
Thank you.
You bet. Happy to help.
All
We
right.
send that to Flo or to you.
Either way, it will get to me eventually.
All right. Okay. Nothing further. Meeting adjourned.